Hello folks, my name is John Ray, and along with my group members, Melanie Lissanikia, Matt Karst, and Abby Broxton, we will be demonstrating some of the aspects of the Portuguese and African slave trade through our eyes. Many events took place to get us to this point in our nation. Some of them more pleasant than others. These are not among the pleasant ones. The Portuguese slave trade and the African slave trade in America played huge parts in the development of the New World. The slave trade was facilitated on the Europe end by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the British. Slaves went to the New World, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean. Ports that exported these slaves from Africa were located along the west coast and stretched all along it. These ports traded in slaves that were supplied by the African communities, tribes, and kingdoms. The researchers estimated that between 2 to 3 million slaves were exported out of this region and were traded for goods like alcohol and tobacco from the Americas and textiles from Europe. The current estimates are about 12 million Africans that were shipped across the Atlantic from West Africa, although the number purchased by the traders is considerably higher. Slaves were the workforce that America used to get itself started as an independent nation. They were the cheap labor that many people utilized on mainly sugar and tobacco plantations. This is a depiction of how tight of a space that many slaves had to fit in. Living conditions weren't good on the ships taking slaves to the Americas.
He's right. The living conditions were awful. The sexes were separated, kept naked, packed close together, and the men were chained for long periods of time. The men and women often had to lie on the ground with their heads resting between the legs of another slave, thus resulting in often having to lay in another person's feces, urine, and sometimes even blood. There were 250 to 600 slaves per ship, and about 12% didn't survive the journey. Slavers controlled what we ate, drank, and when we did so.
We fed them mostly horse beans and rice, and were only allowed to give them 24 ounces of water a day. We also had to make sure that they exercised or danced to make sure that they kept physicals to check.
Slaves were treated unfairly and horribly. They had to deal with unpleasant conditions that costed some their lives. However, it wasn't difficult only for the adult slaves, but for the children slaves as well. This is what it was like for children on their voyage across the Atlantic most of the time. Children on slave ships were treated a little better than the adults because they could move around on deck instead of being stuck below the deck like the adults. Other than that, children were treated the same as adults, little food and no sanitation. They suffer similar, if not equal, experiences to the adults, such as corporal punishment, malnutrition, and illness.
I'm glad I don't have to stay cooped up below deck the whole voyage. Those poor people who have to sit in the urine and blood that might not even be theirs. It doesn't matter if I'm down there or up here, I still get punished and get little food just like the adults. Malnutrition and disease has gotten a lot of people on the ship, and I hope it doesn't get to me. The last time a child got sick, he got thrown overboard.
Hey, are you sick?
As previously said, the conditions on board of the slave ships were unfavorable for everyone, with cramped quarters, spreading disease, and unfathomable filth. It's easy to imagine how diseases to a ship ride to the New World could be. The captain of the ship did nary a thing to ease the hardships faced whilst on the ship. This is a captain standing at the wheel of the ship. The captain is head of the entire ship. He's the boss.
I hold all the power, and I can act in any desired way. I whipped and logged slaves, threw them overboard, and did much, much more. But despite what everyone says, I don't think I treated them too poorly or unfairly. Obviously, if I have power over all these piddly slaves, I will demonstrate my authority any way I please. If any of the slaves object, that's their own problem.
I'm not sure too many people agree with him. Anyone who has the authority to torture other people and doesn't do it incessantly would say that they're a good person. From the view of a slave, the captain is a malicious and foul being whose existence is nothing but a burden of human life. All the slaves that survived the journey to the destinations were put to work in mines in many different plantations. The slaves were sent all over, but mostly to the West Indies and South America. Among these places was the U.S., where tobacco and cotton were the most profitable and popular cash crops. This is an example of what slave working in the field would look like. His master is nearby.
Work harder. That cotton won't pick itself. Slaves are very hopeful, and they make me lots of money. We, who buy the slaves, usually spend around $650 for an 18-year-old healthy male slave. Although female slaves were the most valuable because they could give birth to children who were our slaves by law. And within 2 or 3 years, our slaves earn us back way more money than we would ever dump on them.
The daily life of a slave was extremely difficult. Slaves, especially the ones who worked out in the field, worked from sunrise to sunset. Even small children and elderly were not exempt from these horrible working conditions. Slaves were generally allowed the day off on Sunday and infrequent holidays such as Christmas and the 4th of July. And the places where we lived were very unstable. They were small stick houses and we slept on dirt floors. These shelters had cracks and let in the cold and the wind, and only had thin coverings over the windows. Slave owners only gave us the bare minimum to survive.
Africans were brought to the Americas to do a lot of gruesome work. An example of that was working in mines. They were brought over and sent to work in mines in Central and North America.
We were taken to mines high up in the mountains and spent all day mining for precious metals. We originally worked many hours in the mines, but then it was shortly realized that because of the high altitude, we weren't working at full potential because we would get worn out easily. Since we weren't working the best in these conditions, instead of working in the mines, we spent our time panning for gold in the rivers.
To conclude, there were many horrible events that took place in the slave trade. Many we only touched on, but they were so much more disturbing than we could ever explain. And although the slave trade was a dark part in American history, it had a lasting impact that shaped America into what it is today.